On the 13th day of August, 2010, God decided it was about time he did that whole second coming thing. But as it turned out, he was a little busy that day, so he sent Edgar Wright to do it for him. And for exactly 1 hour and 52 minutes, we were blessed with a beautiful film known as Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Based on a comic book by the same name created by Brian Lee O'Malley, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a comedy action film directed by Edgar Wright, who most of you may know from films such as Shaun of the Dead and Baby Driver. Edgar Wright is known for his incredibly creative directing styles, which shines through his movies, and is personally like 94% of what makes Baby Driver so good, because we all know it wasn't the actors. Regardless, Scott Pilgrim as a comic is heavily influenced by video game motifs. In fact, Scott Pilgrim has a video game, and it's still to this day a pretty popular beat 'em up. I remember it being a pretty big deal and it released on Switch a couple years back. And I mention that because the comic transferred to the video game like flawlessly. Like, it was impressively good how well it transferred to a video game. If you told me that this was a video game first and a comic second, I would have 100% believed you. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was actually a pretty big project for Universal Studios. It was an $85 million project, and they made the most out of every single dollar they used. This movie has very, very good special effects, and although the cast is full of names that would quickly drain the wallets of Hollywood studio execs today, a lot of these actors were B and C-listers when this movie came out. Chris Evans and Brie Larson have notably become A-list actors, both also in the MCU, since this movie has released. I believe back in the 2000s, Brie Larson was actually aiming to become a pop artist as well as an actor, but I don't know if she had any radio hits, although I assume not because the 2 albums she has on Spotify are from 2004 and 2005 respectively, and only 1 song with over 1 million streams. That aside, this movie definitely put a lot of money in its 2 things, its actors and its special effects, both of which are perfect in this film. This movie was apparently in development for 5 to 6 years, so by the time they actually finished the thing, fans had already doubled in age. Edgar Wright apparently first got the call that they wanted him on the movie sometime in 2004. The casting for this movie apparently took as long as up to 2009, just a year and a half before the movie released. Apparently the bulk of the movie was actually the writing phase though. I can't source this reliably, but if I had to take a guess, I'd assume that the reason this took so long is because they had a vast amount of material that they had to condense into one movie. One of the whole comics gets summed down into 1 line in this movie. But this movie 100% warranted its production time because the script came out amazing. It's witty, it's quick, and it's hilarious. Edgar Wright also mentions that this movie has a lot of funny female actresses, which is definitely true. I think it's hard for men to write female characters, and even if they are well-written characters, a lot of men who watch the movie are just gonna be like, oh, women aren't funny, and be pre-biased toward them anyway. But we don't listen to those guys because they've never felt the touch of a woman. But who the f am I? Batman? Enough prep time. Let's get to the part where I fight Superman. And by that I mean we're gonna watch Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. That was clear. I'm not that was a joke. That was supposed to be there's supposed to be a segue here. Scott Pilgrim opens up with a custom animated Universal opening and a voiceover that immediately lets us know that our protagonist is Canadian. Not only Canadian, but he's a pedophile as well, because apparently the first thing wasn't bad enough. And then his friend immediately asked the question that we're all thinking. Is she hot? No, dude, she's not hot, she's 17. We learn that Scott is 22 and awesome, but we soon come to learn that only one of those things is actually true. His friends ask some pretty odd questions for a group of 20-somethings talking about a 17-year-old girl, but oh well. Boys will be boys. Just so we're clear here, the question was, have you guys done it yet? And then Scott makes it immediately questionable whether or not he has an Asian fetish.
Knives, Chow. She's Chinese.
The group is ecstatic to meet Knives, and it turns out they won't have to wait long because Scott invited her to watch them practice this afternoon. And we're officially introduced to all of Scott's friends. Steven Stills, he's based. Kim Pine, she's super based and I'm actually in love with her. And young Neil. He doesn't suck, but he's definitely never had sex. The band's name is Sex Bob-omb, and they're actually really good. But I know what you're thinking, probably. Bob-omb? Like from Mario Brothers. And yeah, like from Mario Brothers. The movie is packed with video game references. Since the start of the film, there's actually been 2 Legend of Zelda sound cues. On top of that, this movie has insanely good visual effects. They really add a lot of depth and personality to this film. The opening here isn't very special and not a great example of that, but it's still very well made. Much like any 17-year-old girl who goes to prep school finding out one more genre of music exists, Knives becomes obsessed with the band, and we cut to the group conversing after practice. From the very, very beginning of this movie, Kim is the only person who has any distrust in Scott, and for valid reason, he is dating a child who is 5 years younger than him, but we go from one based person to another, and we meet Wallace Wells, Scott's 25-year-old gay roommate. Ignore the 7.5 rating that this movie gives him, he is literally the best character in the film. We also see their less than ideal living situation, but that's because, like most pedophiles, Scott is unemployed. Wallace says that he won't tell anybody that Scott is dating a 17-year-old Asian schoolgirl, but he immediately goes to tell Scott's sister, Stacy. Once again, Wallace is based as fuck.
A 17-year-old Chinese schoolgirl? You're ridiculous.
It's a Catholic school, too.
With the uniform and everything?
Yeah.
We learn that Scott is dating Knives almost purely as a rebound, as he was recently dumped by his now famous ex-girlfriend, Brie Larson, portrayed by Brie Larson. We then transition to going to see Scott pick up Knives for a date, or as Wallace more accurately describes it, playtime. And Wallace does the saintly thing and immediately urges Knives to run. We see Scott and Knives playing a rhythm dancing game for a date, but the scene isn't really just silly funny. It shows although they have great chemistry, Scott is a terrible person who is constantly taking advantage of Knives, not only making her pay for their machine, but putting the pressure of continuing the relationship on her. We then meet Aubrey Plaza, portrayed by Aubrey Plaza. She invites him to a party, but the details are spared for now. Later in the date, we see Knives want to purchase a CD from a band called The Clash of Demon Head, the same band that Scott's ex-girlfriend, Amy Adams, it's not actually Brie Larson, I'm sorry I lied, plays in. But after not allowing her to do such, he then just turns around and makes Knives talk about him some more. Knives tries to flirt with him and advance with him, but he just kind of brushes her off. He just makes jokes out of it. Scott shows Knives the house he grew up in and begins to trip the fuck out. And we meet this woman, who tells Scott that he's not actually alone, he's just daydreaming. And then he wakes up from a passionate gay orgy with Wallace's boyfriend, also named Scott. Scott has to then go take his pet miner to the library, and he sees the girl of his dreams. Literally though, like this was the girl that was in his dreams. She must be getting off her shift at Sonic because that is the only reason I can think a teenage girl in 2010 would be wearing roller skates around regularly. Another thing that this movie does absolutely flawlessly is its transitions. They're incredibly creative and seamless. They arrive at the party where Scott finds out this girl's name is Ramona Flowers, and she's actually at the party, so Scott begins the prowl to find her. After hunting her down and another extremely creative transition, he begins using the exact same flirting technique he uses on Knives earlier in the film, but it goes significantly worse. Scott learns from multiple sources that Ramona is way out of his league, but he's an idiot and he just doesn't care. Julie specifically is actively against the idea.
Scott, I forbid you from hitting on Ramona, even if you haven't had a real girlfriend in over a year.
Hey, what?
God, the acting in this movie is hilarious. But this is also the first time we hear foreshadowing of a dude named Gideon. Scott proclaims that Ramona is the girl of his dreams, which once again is technically true. And a drunken Wallace and a sober Stacy both heavily advise that he break up with his fake high school girlfriend. Like, verbatim, they both say fake high school girlfriend. Scott tries to order something from Amazon in the hopes that Ramona will be his delivery girl, as it was mentioned in the last screen that she works for Amazon. Which, I'm gonna be so real with you, I didn't know Amazon existed in 2010. But he gets this mysterious email.
This is boring.
And deletes it. He waits at the door for his package, but it seems like someone else is at the door waiting for his package as well. Is that joke hypocritical of me? Yes, it is, but it was right there. Something that needs to be noted about Scott's relationship with Knives is that he is extremely neglectful of her. His past 2 dates with Knives, he's been a half hour or more late. He is only interested on going with dates or even talking to Knives when it strokes his own ego. Even throughout the progression of the day he's out with Knives, he becomes extremely neglectful and distant on their dates as they're happening. But while Scott was too busy around with minors, Steve was actually busy getting done. He gets the band a gig competing against other bands, and the prize is a record label with G-Man. Scott does the only thing he's good at and neglects Knives some more and hallucinates more about Ramona, and we get this buttery smooth transition while a sick-ass Legend of Zelda rendition plays in the background that for copyright reasons I cannot play. Scott then asks Ramona out, but she's very clearly not interested. It's funny though, because we get these dreams explained to us by Ramona, and she does it so passively and Scott just doesn't question it.
No, it's just you have this really convenient subspace highway running through your head that I like to use. It's like 3 miles and 15 seconds.
Right, right.
I forgot you guys don't have that in Canada.
In case what she said didn't make sense, Ramona has the power to use subspace highways to get from place to place. Scott's mind happens to have intersections in these subspace highways. It's why earlier in this film she passes by him but hardly acknowledges him. The mind she uses for the subspace highway doesn't really matter, it just happened to be Scott's mind at that time. Scott harasses Ramona until she agrees to go on a date with him, and they meet up at a park at 8 p.m. That last bit of information isn't technically relevant, but this review is long enough, why not make it a little bit longer? They hang out and the scene's honestly pretty well done. They learn about each other, notably that Ramona is single, and we actually see one of Ramona's subspace highways that takes her home. Scott walks in on Ramona changing, but she takes that moment to make an advance on Scott, which means that we're 24 minutes and 18 seconds into the movie and Knives already got cheated on. She absolutely deserved better. Scott and Ramona are seemingly about to poke some Hauntus, but she changes her mind last second. And she specifically states that she reserves the right to change her mind later, but don't get your lube out just yet. They're not actually gonna have sex in this film. Sorry for the spoiler, it doesn't happen. See, the thing about Ramona is that she's actually just keeping Scott on a tight leash. Emotionally. I'm pretty sure they're not into physically. Actually, that's a lie. Scott is definitely into physically. Scott invites Ramona to the Rocket, the Battle of the Bands. Now, if you remember, this is exactly where Knives is going to be. This is literally the first thing that happens in the scene, and the fact that nor Ramona or Scott say anything about it says a lot more about both of them than you probably think it does. Oh, and by the way, here's the funniest scene in movie history.
This is a nightmare.
There's not really a joke here, Kim is just hot, and they begin to play the music. The music in this movie is actually really good. So good, in fact, that Knives passes out 7 seconds into them playing. Insert a joke about not lasting long enough during sex here. After about a minute of playing, a wild Matthew Patel appears, and the movie takes a huge tonal shift. You've probably noticed by now, but this movie is really good at getting slowly and progressively weirder. It starts out with subtle things like subspace voids, and now our main protagonist is a video game character. But you probably didn't question either of those things because the movie doesn't really drop you into the deep end. Mostly, but we'll come back to that later. Regardless, it turns out that Scott is a very experienced fighter, and this comes seemingly out of nowhere. But we learn that Matthew is the first of an undisclosed amount of evil ex-boyfriends. This was actually earlier disclosed to him in the email that he got bored of and deleted earlier in the film. Scott questions why Ramona would date this guy, and she explains that they were in 7th grade and he wasn't white and wasn't a jock. I'm glad the standards are that low because that means I have a chance. They kissed one time and she ended it. Oh, and she casually mentions that he has mystic powers, which he then uses in a musical number that's really funny, but once again, copyright's a bitch and I can't play any of it for you. Matthew kills these guys, and then Scott kills Matthew, who promptly turns into spare change. Sex Babama also, in fact, did win the round. Ramona finally gives Scott the lowdown that he should have gotten from the email, and explains that Scott has to defeat all 7 of her evil exes, in that she's very specific about the exes part of that. Also, damn! How do you date 7 evil I feel like I would have noticed, like, maybe by the 3rd one, I'm just attracting the wrong people. But no. 7? Wallace insists that Scott must break up with Knives before his date with Ramona tonight, or he will tell Ramona about Knives. Why not the other way around, I'm not sure, especially because really, Knives is being more wronged in this situation, and I'm also pretty sure that Ramona has already pieced this together. But for now, Wallace kicks Scott out of the apartment so he can watch a marathon of his favorite actor, Lucas Lee, who is played by my baby daddy, Chris Evans. Come home, Chris. The kids miss you. Scott then calls Knives at a phone booth in an attempt to break up with her, but she just happens to be in the area at the same time. Also, Scott is racist.
Hey, I wanted to invite you over for dinner.
Like Chinese food? Are you even allowed to date outside your race or whatever?
But it's okay, because he's a funny kind of racist. But Scott finally breaks up with Knives and breaks her heart doing it. 40 minutes into this film, and nothing but bad things have happened to this girl. She absolutely deserves better. Scott announces that he broke up with Knives, and everybody actually seems pretty annoyed with him. Steve says no more girlfriends at band practice. Why is Kim so fine? The band practices for exactly 7 seconds, and Ramona now has blue hair, and I'm sure the pronouns are on their way. Scott dips in rehearsals, leaving young Neil to play for him, and takes Ramona back to his plate for his hot date. Ramona mentions that Scott's hair's getting kinda shaggy, which actually perfectly and smoothly transitions into us learning that his breakup was exactly 431 days ago, and he's still not over his ex. Holy hell, she's got him in a chokehold. 431 days? She tries to turn the conversation around, but he fumbles and takes her out to go watch the filming of the new Lucas Lee movie that Wallace mentioned earlier. We're introduced to Lucas, and we very quickly find out that Lucas is actually one of Ramona's 7 evil exes. They did it in 9th grade, but the lore gets set aside when Lucas immediately wants to kick Scott's ass. I gotta respect the grind.
Can I have your autograph, please?
But it's funny because unlike Patel, he seems to be doing this more out of a contractual obligation rather than an actual desire, literally saying he seems nice before giving him the 4-knuckle fuckle. This movie gets a lot more slapstick when he gets catapulted into the side of a tower and walks it off. But before the fight starts, the literal goat of the film does this.
Hey, ask him how it feels to always get his sloppy seconds.
And then he just walks away. I love this guy so much. This fight is actually very creative. His thing is doubles, his stunt doubles. The choreography in the scene is actually impressive realistic for having 7 people fight one guy. It's also really hilarious that Lucas Lee's stunt doubles have the voice of Lucas Lee too, even though that is wildly unnecessary. I love this movie. This is when Scott finally learns about the League of Evil Exes in the funniest way possible.
Controlling the future of Ramona's love life?
No.
Oh, well, hey, listen, man, don't worry about it.
Really?
Yeah, let's go get a beer.
That's great.
Boom!
And then Scott asks him to do a grindy thingy on that rail. Scott goads Lucas Lee into grinding over 200 steps down the lowest quality railing you've ever seen for the sake of his own ego, and then he dies. But it's okay, because that is a really cool way to go. But it turns out during all the action, Ramona dipped, and he hasn't been able to get in touch with her since last night. After giving Scott a very emotional pep talk, Wallace says he needs Scott to move out. But the phone rings and Scott gets a call from his evil ex. Envy actually only calls to figure out who Scott is dating, and oh, I lied earlier, this is the funniest thing in the whole movie.
Is Scott here?
You know what? He just left.
Scott leaves to go clear his head, but much like a conservative on Twitter, he then gets ambushed by a lesbian. Also, she's y'alternative. And for those of you who don't know what that is, it's internet slang for anybody who's emo or goth with a southern accent. But after he just kind of asks nicely, she just leaves, which is funny. That's funny. It's funny, guys, trust me. Julie ridicules Scott in the form of peak comedy.
Do that.
How are you doing that with your mouth?
Never mind how I'm doing it.
But the good news is Ramona is in the coffee shop and they actually end up running into Envy Adams, Scott's long-term ex-girlfriend, and she invites the Sex Bob-ombs to play at her show. We then learn that Envy Adams actually cheated on Scott with a guy named Todd, and Ramona actually mentions that she's dated a guy named Todd, so all Todds probably suck. I'm not sure if being namist is a thing, but if so, Ramona is a namist. Scott wakes up from another, larger, gayer orgy, and they all tell Scott to move on from Ramona. Steve accepts a secret show gig that will be opening for the Clash at Demon Head, and they need to play because the buzz and because the G-Man will supposedly be there. And holy fuck, Chinese schoolgirl jump scare! Knives has a breakdown and dyes her hair blue to take Scott back from Ramona. She also seduces young Neil. Yeah, let's be fair, this was probably enough to give a guy a boner in 2010. They play their set, but Steve is concerned they suck, and Knives is stealing Ramona's swag. Oh, and also, Scott has a piss kink.
I'm gonna pee on her.
Envy performs a song called Black Sheep. Quick side note here, this rendition of Black Sheep by Metric gained a lot of popularity for the original version, even though it wasn't even released on the Scott the Pilgrim vs. the World soundtrack, but it apparently was on YouTube at the time. But it was later released on Metric's own Spotify account. This is seemingly due to the song rights being owned by either Metric or the company that Metric works for. But what's funny is that this is now Metric's most popular song on Spotify. Not most played, that still belongs to the original version of the song, but its current most popular, meaning it's getting the most consistent listens as of today, is this version of Metric's Black Sheep. I actually found out the song existed through a Kaylee Morgue cover of this song, and then watched this movie after, so I thought Kaylee Morgue wrote this song for the longest time, but no. It was Metric, and then Kaylee Morgue probably covered it because it was getting popular from the Brie Larson version. Back to the movie though, Envy Adams invites the gang backstage and the tension is high. But after Knives interrupts one too many times, Todd Chris Browns the absolute out of her and actually punches the highlights out of her hair. We know this because young Neil says it twice. This angers Scott and starts the third fight with Ramona's evil exes. But this is going to be Scott's hardest fight. It's going to be his most difficult fight, and it's going to be his most intense fight, because Todd is a vegan. This is important because in this universe, being vegan literally makes you a better person, and not in some metaphorical bullshit sense, like it literally gives you psychic powers. The in-universe explanation for this is that the meat and fat that you eat takes up the 90% of the brain that you don't use, so if you stop eating meat and fat, you get that 100%, and you become psychic. I'm not going to question it. I just believe it. While getting the background for her relationship with Todd, Scott then learns that Ramona has only ever dumped people, never once been dumped. In fact, Ramona started dating Todd after leaving Lucas. She left Lucas to date Todd. Scott quickly finds out that he can't win a battle of strength, so after being ragdolled for the second time in this movie, his friends go to dip and get some pizza. Instead, he tries to beat him in a battle of bass guitars. That battle ends with him being ragdolled for the third time in this movie. After being ragdolled into this concession table, Scott decides he's beat and tries to trick him into losing his vegan henge by giving him coffee with half and half in it. But Todd uses his vegan power and realizes that that was Scott's plan the whole time. But then Scott tricked him. Scott tricked him because he was only thinking about pouring it into that cup really hard. So he poured it into the first cup, but he gave him the second cup. But he thought about pouring it into the second cup. You guys follow me? All right, good. But Scott successfully gets Todd to break his vegan streak, and the vegan police show up. Yes, you heard me correctly, the vegan police. They show up and de-veganize Todd, as this is actually his third offense of breaking vegan henge. Yeah, I remember how I said earlier in this movie that it gets progressively weirder, and we kind of just wouldn't question it. Like, I didn't question it, but it's like, what the fuck? After the vegan police, and I am using direct quotes here, yes, de-veganize Todd, he's left powerless to Scott's attacks.
You once were a vegan, but now you will be gone.
Vegan.
After violently ending Todd's life, Scott and Ramona go to meet up with the rest of the gang at the pizza parlor. Steve is still insisted that they go to the after party and hope that they can rub elbows with the G-spot, and Steve brings everyone else along for the ride. Scott and Ramona finally have a realization that they're bad people and maybe that they're the problem. Scott broke Knives' heart, and we learn that he also broke Kim's heart, and Ramona only dates and breaks up with terrible people. But after they have their cute little heart-to-heart, Scott finally puts together the reason that Ramona is so insistent on Scott using proper verbiage. And Roxy drops the hardest line that I'm surprised and low-key glad that bisexual people never started using.
I was just a little bi-curious.
Well, honey, I'm a little bi-curious.
Ramona steps up to bat for this fight, as Scott is still left tired from the last one. I'm gonna get copyrighted if I use too much audio from the movie, but Roxy calls Ramona a has-been, and that's hilarious. Throughout this fight specifically, we hear them reference Gideon multiple times, saying Ramona needs to do something along the lines of returning to him. This fight is also made more interesting when we learn that Scott is actually contractually obligated to beat Roxy with his own two hands. But unlike Todd, he refuses to hit a woman, so Ramona, an equal rights activist, makes Scott do it anyway. But after being put on the back foot, Scott harnesses the power of Silk Sonic and uses his sexual prowess to defeat his enemies. I'm not shitting you, he makes her orgasm. That's how he wins the fight. Imagine coming so hard that you turn into $57 and lose change. After this fight, Ramona and Scott are seen arguing a bit more, and Ramona says that Scott is just another evil ex waiting to happen. But before departing, she leaves Scott a list that she should have given him approximately 58 minutes ago. A list of all of her evil exes. And it just so happens that the next two exes are the next band the gang has to go up against, and Scott is royally pissed off and ready to face off. In case you're wondering how the next battle is supposed to be against two people at the same time, they're twins. It's never stated how she did twins, whether it was at the same time or different times. Personally, my headcanon is that they did it at the same time. That aside, the next performance is actually an amp versus amp, and both bands will be going up at the same time to perform. Oh, and Ramona is here, and now she has green hair. And I'm still waiting on those damn pronouns. This entire scene is sick as and I heavily encourage you to please go watch this movie when you're done with this video. The music here is so damn good, and the effects are fantastic, and this whole movie is a blast. Regardless, it begins to not look so good for the sex bombs, and it turns out that Gideon is the G-Man that we hear about through the movie. They're the same person, but Scott and the gang do like my ex-girlfriend pretending she loves me, and they put on the best performance of their lives, and the Katanagi twins are down for the count. Scott gets a life and runs into Knives again, but leaves her to chase after Ramona once again, who has left with Gideon. Scott also reveals that
Because I'm in lesbians with you.
but Ramona, seemingly from nowhere, breaks up with Scott for Gideon. Because as she says herself, she just can't help herself around Gideon. But hey, good news, Gideon signs the sex bombs. So hey, it's a win-win in my book. But Scott, for obvious reasons, refuses to sign, and young Neil takes a spot instead. But the most tragic part of all of this,
I said lesbians.
Scott is left in a depressive void, but Stacy tries to talk him back to happiness. Wallace does a very, very shitty job cheering up Scott, and Gideon invites Scott to come see the Sex Bombs perform at his place, without Scott in them. This enrages both Scott and Wallace, and Scott suits up to go kill Gideon. Or at least turn him into coins. I'm assuming these guys are dead. It's never really... I feel like they're dead. They're dead. They're dead. They're dead. Scott arrives and watches the Sex Bombs play without him, and for the love of God, don't tell me I'm into this. Scott gets ready to fight, and he earns his first weapon, the power of love. And please, Kim, please take my hand in marriage, God! Scott kills like 20 people, and holy shit, this scene is cool. But unfortunately, the power of love isn't enough to beat Canadian Elon Musk. But right before Scott gets impaled like a white girl on spring break, Knives comes to save the day, but fails miserably. Gideon then calls Knives Kung Pao chickened, and what the fuck is with all the Asian jokes in this movie? I didn't realize this until just now. I've seen this movie like 6 times. I can't imagine what they would have done if there was literally a single black guy in this movie. Because there's also not. There's not a single black person in this movie. But it turns out that Knives is actually here to get back at Ramona and not hurt Gideon. But Scott and Gideon get back to their fight as well. After the fight progresses, Scott finally admits that he cheated on Knives with Ramona. And while Scott is admitting that he stabbed Knives in the back, Scott himself gets stabbed in the back. Scott has officially died. While he's dead, he learns that Ramona is obsessed with Gideon because she's literally being controlled by Gideon. The device was put on her sometime during the fight with Roxy, but exactly where is unclear. He uses the 1-up he earned earlier in the movie, and instead of just using the passwords that he learned in the previous scene, he just kills these guys now. He literally just kills these guys because it's cool at this point. Scott has a moment of self-actualization, and he earns the power of self-respect, and I fall deeper in love with Kim every time she's on screen. This part of the movie may seem like it happened insanely fast. It may seem that way because it's a commentary video, but no, it's literally been a minute and a half since his revival and him taking Gideon down. Scott owns up again, but this time he actually apologizes and makes up to them both, but it turns out that Gideon is still alive and has a second health bar. This fight is good, but holy shit, they should have put a flash warning here. I'm not going to put one here because I'm using edited footage. I'm not going to show the bright white flashes. But like every time their swords touch, there's a bright white flash. Knives comes in to help with the fight, but eventually her and Scott are knocked out, and saving the day is once again left up to Ramona. But she gets Will Smith, and Scott and Knives team up one more time in a way that's actually very reminiscent of the beginning of this film, once again showcasing their strong chemistry. But after Gideon gives a long speech about how huge and hard his cock is, Scott kicks the absolute shit out of him, and the day is saved. Also, Steve definitely has the right idea. Those are Sacagaweas in there. But just then, and I'm not making this joke up, Nigga Scott shows up. I cannot be the only person who heard this dude say Nigga Scott.
Nigga Scott.
It's not even a bit, it just sounds like they say Nigga Scott. But this actually ends in a really funny way, and it's actually pretty satisfying. Ramona insists that it's time for her to leave because her past keeps coming back and hurting the people around her, including not only Scott, but Knives as well in that statement. And although that's true, the 7 Evil X is already dead. That part's already over. Although Knives is clearly swallowing her sadness in this scene, she's very self-actualized and realizes she's better off without Scott. And Ramona and Scott are better off together, especially since he fought so hard for her in the first place. The two walk into a subspace store together, and the movie ends in a beautiful way for everyone. Scott Pilgrim has finally beat the world. Edgar Wright did an amazing job directing this film. He uses smooth transitions, engaging sound and screen effects, and it keeps the movie interesting and fresh. Even today, these effects stand the test of time. These keep the audience constantly engaged throughout the entire movie, and it throws a lot at the audience. This movie has some great character arcs. I mean, seriously, this movie seemingly just starts out with Scott just being a child predator, but by the end of it, he realizes that being a child predator is wrong. But even still, this being a movie with superpowers and time-space voids, hell, by the end of this movie, Scott cheats death, and we literally don't question any of it because this movie just slowly sets up thing after thing that makes us understand how weird this world really is and why it works. And the reason for that is largely in fact that this movie sets itself up as a video game before anything really happens. The video game audio cues are a huge example of that. The fact that it gives characters ratings also helps edge that in just a bit. It's very clear that this movie isn't really supposed to take place in the real world. Scott Pilgrim is our movie's protagonist, but he's not a good guy. Scott Pilgrim is emotionally abusive and neglectful of Knives. He's self-centered and only does things if they stroke his own ego. or benefit him in some way, shape, or form. Ramona Flowers is very much the same way. She stays in relationships for her own benefit and leaves when someone slightly more interesting comes along. In short, neither of these movies' protagonists are objectively good people, but at the same time, they're perfect for each other. But what makes this movie so interesting is the slow struggles and self-actualizations of these characters that bring them to realize the flaws they have. And the beauty of it is that they slowly fix them. Scott realizes that he's been using knives for emotional attachment, and Ramona realizes that she's been hopping from evil X to evil X for the same reason. It's all the worse because Scott doesn't want to be with knives, and he knows it. In their first date scene, it's perfectly illustrated when we see the countdown on the arcade game that perfectly resembles the stress of not knowing whether or not you want to continue a relationship or not. But even if you don't want to continue the relationship, you may still want to just play the game. Something referenced in the end of this film as well, but Scott instead now confidently walks in with Ramona rather than being hesitant and resistant instead. The supporting cast of this film, although they don't really get much full arcs because this is a comedy movie, are all still amazing. I wish we got more out of Envy Adams. She's seemingly left with regret in her actions for the way she treated Scott, but she doesn't really do much about it. The scene where Scott leaves for the pizza place is the last time we ever see her. I think every character in this movie does their job really well. In my opinion though, Stacy and Julie probably could have been one character. I feel like they kind of fill the same role of being the kind of judgy female outsider perspective, but I think Stacy serves a more significant role of being there for Scott later in this film like no one else really could because she's Scott's sister. I make jokes about Kim just being hot and being eye candy, but she really is one of the most based characters in this film. From the beginning of this film, she tries to get Scott to do the right thing, seemingly because Scott mistreated her in the same way when they previously dated in high school. Young Neil and Steve are sort of ambivalent to Scott's reckless behavior. In fact, they seem to support it, which makes sense. Like, let's be real, if we're being 100%, it's realistic that only the woman and the one gay man that are around Scott are the only ones who are looking out for the females' hearts that he's breaking. Also, Wallace having an open relationship in 2010 is a hilarious stereotype, but would probably be problematic in today's Twitter. I can seriously see how people would be outraged about the only gay character in this movie also being the only person in an open relationship. All of the evil X's are kind of cardboard cutout douchebags, but I mean, that's the point, and it works really well actually. They're all written really fucking well. Like, aside from the 20 seconds of lore each of them get, all of their scripts are actually really well written, especially Lucas Lee. Also, the fact that Chris Evans was 29 in the scene is absolutely crazy to me. He wasn't even Captain America at this time, which is wild to think about. It's genuinely a wild thing to think about and look at for people who are my age who didn't really see his early career before Captain America. Although I've argued that this movie is perfect in a lot of ways, there are things that it could do better. Notably, the pacing being a large issue. Although I think for the most part they introduce elements smoothly and well, a lot happens very fast in this movie. I mean, 2 of the 7 evil X's are fought in the same night, about 5 minutes for each other, and then one after that, immediately in the scene after it. The first 30 minutes of this movie are entirely exposition, and the second half of this movie is entirely action. The first fight in this movie is 30 minutes in, the second fight in this movie is 45 minutes in, the third is an hour in, the fourth is an hour and 14 minutes in, but keep in mind that the third fight goes on until about an hour and 10 minutes into the movie, so you have 4 minutes of room in between 2 fights. The 5th fight is 8 minutes after that, the 6th is 8 minutes after that, and the 7th is 3 minutes after that. This movie drastically picks up its pacing, largely just because of how many introductions we have to get in the first 30 minutes of the movie. But once again, we have to keep in mind that they're adapting a whole comic book series into one movie, so I think they did handle it pretty well. Aside from that, I've spotted nothing but praise for this movie. Wait, so how much did this movie end up making anyway? Only $49.3 million out of an estimated $85 million budget. So why did this movie fail? Well, it wasn't because this movie was bad, we've established that much, and that's not even my opinion. Generally speaking, reviews for today, even when this movie came out, the reviews are generally positive. The answer is just simply because of what the movie is. The movie is PG-13, so you're already alienating a lot of the audience that might be interested in something like this. A silly, crude humor video game movie based on a comic. That doesn't necessarily appeal to adults, and a lot of kids aren't gonna go want to ask their mommy to go see this flick. I made a joke about how the kids who watched this movie were probably 6 when Scott Pilgrim vs. the World came out. I remember Scott Pilgrim vs. the World books being in Scholastic book fairs. It wasn't a small comic, they wouldn't have made a movie off of it had it not been, but it clearly didn't have the number of dedicated fans who wanted to see a movie about this. And I'm sure that the kids that this movie did appeal to didn't want to go get mommy's approval to go see the new PG-13 Michael Cera flick. Simply put, this movie didn't really have the audience to go make $80 million at the box office, which is unfortunate because I'm pretty sure most people would love this movie. In fact, most people do love this movie. As of the time I'm writing this script, it's the most liked film on Netflix. I don't have Netflix on my computer, it's my family's account, so I can't screenshot it, so just trust me on this, but I'm pretty sure by the time this video gets up, it'll still be there. People have absolutely come around to this flick, but there are other reasons this movie flopped. It didn't really have that much star power. Chris Evans, Brie Larson, and Aubrey Plaza are notable names now, but they weren't the biggest back in 2010. And what I've heard from my research, and by that I mean my Reddit searches, Michael Cera wasn't even that popular, or rather, he wasn't that well received in 2010. The last and arguably the largest reason for this film was its poor marketing. It was marketed more as a teen rom-com and less as an action comedy, which absolutely hurt this film at the box office. But like I said before, this movie would absolutely do much better today than it did 10 years ago, and I'm more than a little confident that a sequel for this film could easily pass a $500 million at the box office if they made one. But that's absolutely never going to happen. Regardless, this video is kind of getting long, so let's go ahead and give this movie a score. For Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, I'm feeling a solid 9 out of 10, and for the fun score, I'm also going to give it a 9 out of 10. Which is the first time I've scored a movie the same on the critical score as I have the fun score. It's just that the reason that I'm taking a point off of both scores is the same. It's just really slow in the first 30 minutes of the movie. The exposition and pacing of the movie are the only reasons I'm going to take one score off of this film. Since this movie is now on Netflix, I highly recommend you watch it. It's an absolute blast, and copies of this movie are still relatively easy to obtain. So if I remember, I'm going to put a link in the bio toward like an Amazon link or something. Watch and buy the movie. Anyway, me and the boys here are going to go hit the gym. That is true. I am gonna go watch Scott Pilgrim vs. the World again.